Dive in. Let's go. Number 10. The sealed chamber beneath the Pyramid of Amenhotep. In 1989, a joint Egyptian and French archaeological team, led by geophysicist Gilles Dormion, began conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys beneath the pyramid complex of Amenhotep II at Dahshur, roughly 40 kilometers south of Cairo. The survey was routine. The pyramid had been studied since the 19th century. The internal chamber layout was considered well understood. The radar was expected to confirm what the existing maps already showed. It did not confirm the existing maps. It found something that was not on them. The radar returns indicated a chamber beneath the pyramid's western corridor that did not correspond to any known architectural feature of the structure. The cavity was larger than the antechambers already documented in the complex. It sat at a depth that placed it below the bedrock foundation level, which meant it had been cut into the limestone before the pyramid was built. Not inside the pyramid, beneath it, predating it. Whatever was down there had been sealed under one of the largest stone structures in human history for a period that the team's calculations placed at a minimum of 3,500 years. The team submitted a formal excavation request to the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities. The request was reviewed. It was declined. The official response cited structural concerns about excavating beneath an active heritage site. A follow-up request submitted 2 years later received the same response. The chamber has never been excavated. The radar data has never been fully published in peer-reviewed literature. The cavity sits beneath the western corridor of the Pyramid of Amenhotep II, at a depth that no excavation permit has ever been granted to reach. Here is where the Dormion survey stops being an administrative frustration and becomes something that should disturb anyone who thinks about what 3,500 years of sealed darkness preserves. The limestone geology of the Dahshur Plateau is extraordinarily stable. Humidity levels beneath the pyramid foundation are among the lowest of any subsurface environment in Egypt. The conditions inside a sealed chamber at that depth, in that geology, in that climate, are almost perfectly preservative. Whatever was placed in that cavity before the pyramid was built above it has been sitting in near-perfect preservation conditions for longer than the Roman Empire existed. Dormion spent the following decade attempting to gain access through alternative survey methods: muon tomography, thermal imaging, acoustic resonance mapping. Each attempt produced data consistent with the original radar returns. Each attempt produced another declined excavation permit. The chamber is real. The preservation conditions are ideal. The contents are unknown, and the structure built above it to ensure it stays that way has been doing its job for 35 centuries without interruption. The pyramid was not built to contain what is inside it. It was built above something that was already there. That is the detail the official record does not emphasize, and the chamber beneath it has been waiting in the dark, under 3,500 years of stone, for a permit that has not yet been issued. Number 9. The Cave of Altamira and the paintings that destroyed themselves when we found them. On November 18, 1879, Spanish nobleman Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola was excavating the floor of a cave on his property near Santillana del Mar in northern Spain when his 8-year-old daughter Maria looked up at the ceiling and said, "Toros, toros." Bulls, bulls. Sautuola raised his lantern. The ceiling of the cave was covered in paintings. Bison, deer, horses, and human handprints rendered in red ochre, black manganese, and yellow clay with a naturalistic precision and anatomical accuracy that the art world of 1879 was not prepared to accept as prehistoric. The paintings were 36,000 years old. The scientific establishment spent the following 20 years insisting they were forgeries. Sautuola died in 1888 without receiving formal vindication. The cave was eventually recognized as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. Then we opened it to tourists, and the paintings began to die. The Cave of Altamira had maintained a stable internal environment for 36,000 years, temperature constant at approximately 14 degrees Celsius, humidity stable at 94%, carbon dioxide levels balanced by the absence of anything breathing inside the sealed space. The moment human visitors began entering in significant numbers, every one of those parameters began to shift. Body heat raised the temperature. Exhaled breath altered the carbon dioxide balance. Skin and clothing introduced microbial life that the cave's ecosystem had never encountered. Within decades of public opening, green algae had begun colonizing the painted surfaces. Black fungi were spreading across the bison that had survived 36,000 years of geological time without a single cell of contamination. In 1977, the cave was closed to public access entirely. The damage was assessed. The findings were not fully published. What the conservation teams documented in the years following closure was a fungal and microbial community that had established itself so thoroughly in the cave ecosystem that removal was considered more dangerous to the paintings than leaving the contamination in place. The organisms introduced by human visitors in less than a century of access had become part of the cave's biological fabric. Removing them would require chemical treatments that the pigments could not survive. Here is where Altamira stops being a conservation tragedy and becomes something more disturbing. The same pattern has been documented in cave systems across Europe and Southeast Asia, wherever prehistoric art has been discovered and subsequently opened to visitors. Lascaux in France, Chauvet, Font de Gaume. In each case, the discovery triggered access. The access triggered contamination. The contamination triggered closure. And in each case, the damage done in the brief window of human visitation proved partially or fully irreversible. The paintings at Altamira survived 36,000 years of ice ages, geological shifts, and the complete transformation of the European ecosystem above them. They did not survive 80 years of human breath. The cave is sealed now. A replica has been built nearby for visitors. The original paintings exist in a controlled darkness that no tourist will ever enter again, and the fungi that arrived in human lungs in the 1950s are still in there with them, growing in the dark, on the oldest art on Earth. Number 8. The Poisoned Labyrinth of Naupa, Huaca. In 2012, a team of archaeologists and independent researchers investigating pre-Incan sites in the Sacred Valley of Peru began documenting a structure carved into a cliff face above the village of Ollantaytambo that did not fit any known architectural category from the region. The site, known locally as Naupa Huaca, consisted of a series of precisely cut niches, doorways, and interior chambers carved directly into the living rock of the mountainside. The cutting precision was inconsistent with the tools available to the cultures previously believed to have occupied the site. The angles were exact, the surfaces were smooth. The interior geometry included features that served no obvious ceremonial or structural purpose by any framework the team could apply. What made the site particularly significant was a sealed interior passage running horizontally into the cliff behind the principal carved facade. The passage was partially blocked by a stone, fitted so precisely into the carved opening that it had remained in place without mortar for an estimated several hundred years. When the research team removed the stone to assess the interior, the air that emerged from the passage caused 2 team members to experience immediate dizziness, headache, and nausea within minutes of exposure. A third member, who had leaned into the opening to illuminate the interior with a flashlight, reported temporary visual disturbance and was removed from the site. The passage was resealed. Air samples collected at the opening before resealing indicated elevated concentrations of carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide consistent with a sealed geological environment that had accumulated volcanic outgassing over centuries of closure. The passage had been sealed long enough for the internal atmosphere to become chemically hostile to human respiratory function. But here is where Naupa Huaca stops being a geological curiosity and becomes something that should change how you think about why certain chambers were sealed in the first place. The stone that had blocked the passage was not a natural rock fall. It was cut. It was fitted. It was placed deliberately by whoever had last been inside. The passage had been intentionally sealed from the outside. Someone who knew what was in there had decided it should stay in there. And the chemical environment inside the passage suggests that whoever made that decision may have understood or experienced exactly what the atmosphere inside would do to anyone who opened it afterward. The site remains active in the archaeological literature, but the sealed passage has not been formally excavated. The air quality inside the passage has not been surveyed at depth. The interior of the horizontal chamber remains undocumented beyond the partial illumination achieved by the flashlight before the team was evacuated. What the flashlight revealed in the seconds before the team member was pulled back has been described in field notes that have not been published in any peer-reviewed journal. The notes exist. The passage is still there. The stone is back in place, and the air behind it has been accumulating in the dark for however long it takes for a sealed volcanic chamber to become somewhere a human being cannot breathe. Number 7. The Wellcome cave system and the bones that should not have been there. In 1935, British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod completed her excavation of the Tabun cave at Mount Carmel in present-day Israel, a site that had already yielded one of the most complete Neanderthal skeletons ever recovered. The excavation had reached a depth of roughly 25 meters below the cave entrance, cutting through layers of occupation that stretched back more than 500,000 years. At the lowest accessible level, Garrod's team encountered a passage running horizontally into the cliff that the excavation had not anticipated and that no prior survey of the site had indicated. The passage was narrow. It required crawling. 2 team members entered with lanterns and advanced approximately 15 meters before the air quality deteriorated to the point where the lantern flames began to dim. They retreated. Before retreating, they noted, in the field record, that the passage floor was covered in bones. Not scattered bones, arranged bones. The specific phrasing in Garrod's field notes, later published in the excavation report, described the arrangement as deliberate in a way that was inconsistent with natural deposition. The passage was not excavated. The air quality made further penetration without breathing apparatus impossible using the equipment available to the 1935 expedition. Garrod noted the passage in her report, described its contents briefly, and recommended follow-up investigation with appropriate respiratory equipment. The follow-up investigation was not conducted during her lifetime. The site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Location in 2000. Access to the lower excavation levels is now restricted by the heritage designation. The passage has not been formally entered since 1935. Here is where the Tabun passage stops being an unfinished excavation and becomes something that should disturb anyone who thinks about what deliberately arranged bones in a sealed passage mean. The Tabun cave was occupied by Neanderthals for a period spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The behavioral complexity required to deliberately arrange remains in a sealed interior passage is not consistent with the model of Neanderthal cognition that dominated paleoanthropology in 1935. It is barely consistent with the revised model that emerged from subsequent decades of research. What Garrod's team saw in the lantern light before the flames began to dim would, if formally documented, represent evidence of mortuary behavior in Neanderthals, at a depth and date that no subsequent excavation has approached. The bones are still there. The passage is still there. The heritage designation that now protects the site also prevents the investigation that would determine what the bones mean. The arranged dead of the Tabun passage have been waiting in the dark for 89 years since the last human being saw them. And the air that forced Garrett's team to retreat in 1935 has had nearly a century to become more of whatever it was that dimmed the lantern flames. Number 6. The Red Queen's tomb and the mercury that preserved everything inside it. In 1994, Mexican archaeologist Arnoldo González Cruz was excavating a sealed burial chamber within the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque in the Mexican state of Chiapas, when his team broke through a stone wall that had been mortared shut from the inside. The chamber beyond was intact, undisturbed. The walls, the floor, and the sarcophagus inside were coated in a thick layer of vivid cinnabar, powdered mercury sulfide, that had preserved everything it covered in a state of near-perfect chemical stasis for approximately 1,300 years. The skeleton inside the sarcophagus was covered in cinnabar from skull to feet. Jade ornaments had been placed across the body. A jade mask covered the face. The identity of the occupant has never been definitively established. She is known in the archaeological literature as the Red Queen. DNA analysis has been attempted multiple times with inconclusive results. The cinnabar that preserved her bones so completely also contaminated the DNA samples extracted from them. Here is where the Red Queen's tomb stops being a remarkable archaeological find and becomes something that should change how you think about what the Maya knew about chemistry. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide. Mercury is one of the most potent antimicrobial substances known to chemistry. A sealed chamber coated in powdered mercury sulfide is, effectively, a sterile environment. No bacterial decomposition, no fungal growth, no insect activity. The organic material inside the chamber, the body, the organic components of the jade settings, any perishable offerings, was preserved by the same chemical principle that 19th century medicine used mercury compounds for before the toxicity was fully understood. The Maya of Palenque coated their most important burial in a substance that prevented decomposition through heavy metal toxicity. They sealed the chamber from the inside. They left the Red Queen in a mercury-saturated environment that preserved her for 13 centuries. Whether they understood the chemistry or simply observed that cinnabar kept things from rotting is a question the archaeological record cannot answer. What the record can answer is that it worked, and that the archaeologists who entered the chamber in 1994 did so without respiratory protection adequate for a mercury-saturated enclosed space. 3 members of the excavation team reported health symptoms in the months following the discovery that were consistent with low-level mercury exposure. The reports were not formally connected to the excavation in any published medical literature. The chamber has since been sealed again under controlled conditions. The Red Queen remains inside it. The cinnabar that preserved her is still on the walls, and the mercury vapor that accumulates in a sealed cinnabar-lined chamber over 1,300 years was still present in that room when the first modern human being broke through the wall and took a breath. Number 5. The Houska Castle Pit and what the Holy Roman Emperor found at the bottom. Houska Castle sits on a sandstone outcrop in the Kokoszynsko region of the Czech Republic, approximately 47 kilometers north of Prague. It was built in the 13th century by Přemysl Otakar II, King of Bohemia and Duke of Austria. The castle has no water source. It has no defensive strategic value. It controls no trade route. It was built, by every architectural analysis ever conducted on the structure, for no discernible military or economic purpose. The only feature of the site that distinguishes it from the surrounding terrain is a pit in the sandstone beneath the chapel floor, a vertical shaft dropping into the rock that predates the castle by an unknown period, and that local accounts, recorded in documents dating to the medieval period, describe as bottomless. The castle was built specifically over the pit. The chapel floor was laid directly above it. The entire structure exists, by the architectural evidence, to cover something rather than to occupy or defend a position. In the years following the castle's construction, historical records indicate that prisoners condemned to death were offered commutation of their sentences in exchange for being lowered into the pit on a rope and reporting what they found. The accounts of what the prisoners described upon being pulled back up were recorded by castle scribes and survive in fragmentary form in the regional archives of Bohemia. The accounts are inconsistent in their details. They are consistent in one particular. Every prisoner who went down came up asking to be pulled out immediately. None of them completed the descent to whatever the pit's actual depth was. None of them, in the surviving accounts, were willing to describe specifically what they had seen. Here is where Houska Castle stops being a medieval curiosity and becomes something that should make you reconsider what a 13th century king understood about what was in the ground beneath his kingdom. Premisl Otakar II was one of the most powerful rulers in Central European history. He commanded the resources to build any structure anywhere in his territory. He chose to spend a significant portion of his reign's building budget on a castle with no military value, in a location with no strategic significance, positioned specifically over a hole in the ground. The architectural decision makes no sense in any framework except one. He believed something was in the pit, and he believed a stone chapel built above it was preferable to leaving it open. Geological surveys of the Houska sandstone conducted in the 20th century confirmed that the pit is a natural shaft in the rock formation running to a depth that has never been formally measured. The shaft connects to a wider cave system beneath the Kokoshinsko Plateau. The cave system has never been fully explored. The pit beneath the chapel floor has not been entered with modern equipment. The castle is now a tourist attraction. The chapel is open. The floor above the pit is intact. And whatever caused the condemned prisoners of the 13th century to demand to be pulled back up before they reach the bottom is still down there, in a cave system that has never been mapped, beneath a castle that a king built specifically to make sure no one reached it. Number 4. The Gobekli Tepe enclosures that were deliberately buried. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived at a site on the Harran Plain in southeastern Turkey that a survey team had catalogued in 1963 and dismissed as a medieval cemetery. Schmidt looked at the same mounds the 1963 survey had noted and reached a different conclusion. He began excavating. What emerged from the first season of digging forced a fundamental revision of the timeline of human civilization. Gobekli Tepe is a complex of circular stone enclosures built between 11,500 and 10,000 years ago. The structures predate Stonehenge by 6,000 years. They predate the invention of pottery. They predate agriculture. They were built by hunter-gatherers who, by every prior model of prehistoric social organization, should not have possessed the coordination, the population density, or the conceptual framework to construct monumental architecture of any kind. The T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, are carved with animals in high relief: foxes, scorpions, cranes, lions, with a technical precision that no tool from the period should have been capable of producing. The site rewrote the beginning of human history. And then Schmidt discovered something that the archaeology community has spent the following 3 decades trying to explain. The enclosures at Gobekli Tepe were not abandoned. They were buried, deliberately, intentionally, by the same people who built them, or their immediate descendants, around 10,000 years ago. The enclosures were filled with clean limestone rubble, not collapsed debris, not accumulated sediment, but actively transported and deposited fill material brought from outside the structures and placed inside them in a process that would have required organized labor on a scale comparable to the original construction. Here is where Gobekli Tepe stops being an archaeological marvel and becomes something that should disturb anyone who thinks about what deliberate burial means. The people who buried the enclosures knew what they were burying. They had built the structures, used them for whatever purpose they served across what Schmidt estimated as centuries of active use, and then decided that they should no longer be accessible. They did not abandon them. They did not simply walk away. They filled them in. They covered them. They put them underground and left them there with the apparent intention that they should remain underground. The burial is what preserved them. The limestone rubble that sealed the enclosures protected the carvings from weathering for 10,000 years. Without the deliberate burial, the site would not exist in the form that Schmidt found it. The people of Gobekli Tepe preserved their most important structures by hiding them. And the question that the archaeological literature has never answered with confidence is what they were hiding them from, or what they were hiding inside them. Only 5% of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys indicate that the buried enclosures extend across an area of approximately 300 by 300 meters. The remaining 95% of Gobekli Tepe is still underground, still sealed, still exactly as the people who built it left it 10,000 years ago when they filled it in and walked away. The largest prehistoric site ever discovered is almost entirely unexcavated, and the people who made it chose to seal it themselves before anyone else could. Number 3. The Cave of Crystals and the Air That Kills in 45 Minutes. In the year 2000, brothers Juan and Pedro Sanchez were drilling a new tunnel in the Naupa mine in Chihuahua, Mexico, at a depth of approximately 300 meters below the surface, when their drill broke through into a void. They shone a light through the opening and saw something that took several seconds to understand. The void was filled with crystals. Not small crystals. Crystals of selenite, a form of gypsum, that had been growing in a sealed hydrothermal environment for approximately 500,000 years, reaching lengths of up to 11 meters and diameters of up to 4 meters. The largest natural crystals ever documented on Earth, in a cave that had been sealed since before modern humans existed. The cave could not simply be entered. The internal temperature was 58 degrees Celsius. The humidity was 99%. The combination of temperature and humidity produces a condition where the air itself transfers heat into human lung tissue faster than the body can dissipate it. An unprotected person entering the cave begins experiencing heat stroke within minutes. Loss of consciousness follows within approximately 10 minutes. Death from hyperthermia occurs within 45 minutes of entry without protection. Scientists who studied the cave did so in specially designed cooling suits connected to ice packs and compressed air systems. Even with full protection, safe exposure time inside the Cave of Crystals was limited to approximately 45 minutes per session. The suits were heavy. The visibility inside the cave was limited by condensation. Moving around the crystal formations without damaging them required extraordinary care in conditions where heat stress was degrading cognitive function in real time. But here is where the Cave of Crystals stops being an extreme environment challenge and becomes something that should make you reconsider what the sealed world beneath your feet contains. The crystals grew in a hydrothermal environment, fed by magma chambers beneath the Naupa mountain. The water that fed the crystal growth was supersaturated with calcium sulfate at a temperature of exactly 58 degrees Celsius, the precise temperature at which selenite neither grows nor dissolves, but maintains perfect equilibrium. The cave was sealed at that temperature for 500,000 years. The crystals grew at a rate of approximately 1 centimeter per century. The 11-meter specimens represent 500,000 years of continuous growth in conditions of such precise chemical stability that a 1-degree temperature variation in either direction would have stopped the process entirely. In 2017, NASA astrobiologist Penelope Boston announced that her team had extracted microorganisms from fluid inclusions inside the crystals. Living microorganisms, dormant but viable. Organisms that had been sealed inside the crystal matrix for between 10,000 and 50,000 years. They were revived in the laboratory. They grew. They reproduced. Life that had been locked in stone for tens of thousands of years came back when the conditions that had preserved it were restored. The Naupa mine was flooded in 2017, when pumping operations that had kept the lower levels dry were suspended. The Cave of Crystals is now underwater again. The crystals are submerged. The cave is sealed by the same groundwater that originally formed it. The microorganisms that Boston's team revived from the crystal inclusions are in a laboratory somewhere. The ones that were not sampled are back in the dark, in the water, in the crystal, waiting for the next time someone drills through the wall and lets the air in. Number 2. The tomb of Huang and the mercury rivers that have kept everyone out for 2,200 years. In 221 BC, Yingzheng, the first emperor of a unified China, completed his conquest of the 6 warring states and took the name Qin Huang, the first emperor. Within months of his coronation, he began construction of his tomb. The project employed an estimated 700,000 workers across the following 36 years of his reign. The outer perimeter of the tomb complex covers approximately 56 square kilometers. The burial mound itself rises 76 meters above the surrounding plain, near the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province. It is one of the largest funerary structures ever built, and no archaeologist has ever entered the central burial chamber. The reason is chemistry. The Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, writing approximately 100 years after the emperor's death, described the tomb's interior in his Records of the Grand Historian. He wrote that craftsmen had constructed rivers and seas of mercury inside the burial chamber, with mechanical devices to keep the mercury in continuous motion. The ceiling was set with pearls to represent stars. The floor was a scale map of the empire. The entire interior was designed to replicate the world the emperor had ruled, in a medium that would preserve it for eternity. For 2 millennia, Sima Qian's account was treated as literary exaggeration. Then, in the 1980s, geochemical surveys of the burial mound detected mercury concentrations in the soil above the tomb that were dramatically elevated above background levels. The mercury was real. The rivers were real. The sealed chamber beneath the burial mound contains liquid mercury in quantities sufficient to produce soil contamination detectable at the surface 2,200 years after the chamber was sealed. Here is where the tomb of Qin Shi Huang stops being an archaeological challenge and becomes something that should make you reconsider what 2,200 years of sealed mercury vapor accumulation produces in an enclosed space. Mercury vapor is colorless and odorless. It is absorbed through the lungs with nearly 80% efficiency. Acute mercury vapor exposure produces pulmonary edema, neurological damage, and death without the exposed individual necessarily being aware they are being poisoned until the symptoms are irreversible. A sealed chamber containing rivers of liquid mercury that have been evaporating into a fixed volume of air for 2,200 years contains a concentration of mercury vapor that no modern protective equipment rated for archaeological fieldwork is designed to handle. The Chinese government has declined every excavation proposal submitted for the central burial chamber on the grounds that current technology cannot adequately protect excavators or preserve the contents once exposed to air. The official position is that excavation will proceed when the technology exists to do it safely. The technology does not yet exist. The tomb remains sealed. The mercury rivers described by Sima Qian are still in motion inside the chamber, driven by the mechanical devices the emperor's craftsmen built to keep them flowing. Or they have stopped moving, and the mercury sits still in the dark. in a concentration of vapor that 22 centuries of evaporation has made into something no living person has yet survived long enough to describe. The first emperor wanted his tomb to last forever. He chose the right preservative. And the chamber that holds whatever else he placed inside it has been waiting, sealed, toxic, and intact, for longer than the Roman Empire existed, longer than Christianity has existed, longer than any continuous human institution currently operating on Earth. The mercury is still in there, and it is still keeping everyone out. Number 1. The door of Padmanabhaswamy Temple, and the chamber no living person has entered in recorded history. The Padmanabhaswamy Temple in Thiruvananthapuram, Kerala, India, is one of the wealthiest religious institutions on Earth. In 2011, a Supreme Court of India appointed committee opened 5 of the temple's 6 known underground vaults for inventory assessment. What they found in those 5 vaults became international news: gold statues, diamond-encrusted ornaments, thousands of precious stones, ceremonial objects of incalculable historical value. The inventory of the 5 opened vaults was estimated at approximately $1 trillion, making the Padmanabhaswamy Temple the wealthiest place of worship ever documented in human history. The 6th vault was not opened. Vault B, as it is designated in the court record, has 2 doors. The outer door is a standard iron door that the committee examined. Behind it is a second door. The second door has no visible hinges, no visible lock mechanism, no handle, no keyhole. It is a solid iron surface set into the stone of the vault entrance, with no apparent means of opening it from the outside. It is covered in carvings of 2 cobras. The temple priests who maintain the complex state that the door has not been opened in living memory. Their predecessors, in the oral tradition of the temple, state that it has not been opened in the memory of anyone who has ever served the temple. The committee requested that the door be opened for inventory assessment. The temple administration refused. The refusal was upheld by the Supreme Court of India on the grounds that the vault is a sacred space governed by religious authority rather than civil jurisdiction. The court order that opened the other 5 vaults was not applied to Vault B. Here is where the door of Padmanabhaswamy Temple stops being a legal and religious dispute and becomes something that should make you think carefully about what a door with no lock and no handle is designed to do. A door that cannot be opened from the outside is not a door that was designed to be opened from the outside. It was designed to be opened, if at all, from within, or it was designed not to be opened at all. The carvings of cobras on the outer surface are consistent with Hindu iconography associated with guardianship of sacred or dangerous spaces. The tradition in several Hindu temple traditions holds that certain sealed spaces contain objects or energies that should remain undisturbed, and that the seal itself is a form of protection directed outward as much as inward. The temple priests state that the door can be opened only through the chanting of a specific Garuda mantra by a practitioner of sufficient spiritual authority. No such practitioner, they state, currently exists. Archaeological and structural engineers who have examined the outer door have proposed that the inner door may be held in place by a water pressure mechanism connected to an underground water source, a hydraulic seal that maintains closure through constant pressure from behind. If accurate, forcing the door would not open it, it would break it. And whatever the water pressure has been holding in place would no longer be held. The 5 opened vaults contained $1 trillion in documented treasure, accumulated over centuries of royal patronage and religious offering. The 6th vault is larger than any of the 5 that were opened. No one knows what is inside it. No living person has seen inside it. No historical record describes its contents. The door has no handle. The court cannot compel it to be opened. The priests say no one alive knows how, and the water behind it, if the hydraulic hypothesis is correct, has been pressing against the inside of that iron door for longer than anyone can remember. The wealthiest temple in human history has a room no one has entered. The door that seals it cannot be opened from outside, and the only people who might have known what was in there have been dead for longer than the memory of the institution that guards it. The door is still there, the cobras are still on it, and whatever is behind it has been in the dark for so long that the dark has become the only thing that knows it exists. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe.